Do you like my gator head? It's to intimidate my subordinates.
It's not working.
I got to get a full size. Actually, this is a real gator head.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's alive. Well, it was alive.
Well, now I feel like I'm going to break it.
If you look into its eyes, it tells you your future.
Are these real teeth?
They're real. They're as real as they ever were when it was alive.
Yeah, that would not be fun to get
No,
bit by this.
no. I'm hoping it was just a full size, like pygmy gator instead of them killing like a baby one for my desk ornament. It's pretty cool though. Got it in Florida, of course. No comment.
No, you could have just asked where you got it in Florida.
Cool, man. You just released your server components course on Build UI.
Yeah. Yep.
Pretty sweet. Got that done. 9 videos. It's like a data fetching course. So I think it was nice to be able to focus on that because that's like, there's obviously a lot more than just data fetching, but it's a big part of the new architecture. So I really liked the course.
Yeah.
I thought it turned out really well.
Yep. The course was from, I built like this dashboard app where it showed like a list of users and you could search and filter. And I remember when I did that in server components, I was just amazed at how much better the code was. Like no effects, no fetch requests, no loading states, just all that stuff disappeared. So basically the course is rebuilding that.
Nice.
So it's really cool.
Awesome. It's cool too how like the little parts of the DX that got better with server components, like you could say Next 12 had get server side props. So you could avoid use effect for data. You could use that for data fetching. But the way it's serialized and gets hydrated in the client, the little marginal kind of like the sum of all the marginal benefits of a server component model, not only do you get to fetch in the server, but you render on the server too, it adds up for a really nice experience, especially when you compare it to fetching the client with use effect, but even if you compare it to fetching with get server side props in Next 12.
Yeah. We worked on it. We consulted on a Next 12 app that used get server side props, and you needed components way down in the tree to get data. So you're either like prop drilling, or in our case, we had set up context to share it. But all that stuff is like, it just feels like you're giving like too much rope, and we're just going to make a mistake at some point. So I love that, like this server component pattern, like any server component can fetch its own data. And this is like now in React, which is just, it's so great that this is like a React Bless pattern.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I think the reading side is the most fleshed out part of it.
Yes.
Yep. So in the future, we'll definitely be doing some course work on the writing side once server actions stabilize are still in alpha, and all those APIs are still shaken out. So anyways, that's really cool. And today we want to kind of pick up where we left off last week. We were talking about your custom RSC implementation, and I think we had just gotten through the reading side.
Yep.
So we did want to talk about server actions today.
Yeah. So I guess where did we leave off last week? We talked about how like you have this like app running in the browser that's running React in the browser. You have a React app running on the server that's running your server components. And like those are two different apps or two different processes, but you want to write in a single paradigm. So you introduce this idea of a bundler where you get to write like what you think is an editor or is a coder as one app. And then the bundler kind of teases apart the server bits and the client bits. And I think we got into how when you're rendering client components on the server, like React has a way where it can just leave references to those client components. So then when it hands the payload off to the browser to like take the payload and draw pixels, it can look at those. The browser knows how to render those references. So it's basically there's like a system for the browser to come across there's a system for the server to come across some code, say, I don't know how to deal with it, hand it off to the browser, and the browser can take over at that point. So we're going to get into server actions, which are basically that. Like basically it's that system. It's just in reverse. It's when the browser doesn't know how to do something, it asks the server to do it. So I guess like where should we start with server actions? Like should we talk about,
I guess, what's the motivation? So the motivation from going from server to client is, like you said, you have a tree you're rendering. You come across something that needs the size of the window. It needs browser APIs to attach event handlers, or maybe it doesn't even I guess it needs React State is another one. You could imagine having state eventually attach some event handler somewhere, but you need to do something like that. So you switch it out with a reference. And once you render on the client sees the reference, knows how to render. So what kinds of things do you encounter on the client that you need the server for? And so we write event handlers in the client. You can attach a click listener, console log to the console, or fire off a network request. But in this case, again, in the same way that you can import a client component and render it, and this whole reference system is happening behind the scenes, it's not affecting the mental model of the developer. Part of the goal here is that you write a click handler for a form submission or submit handler, and you want to do some mutation on the server side and avoid the network having to think about it, having to create a new API endpoint. And so it's at that point, I want to insert a row in my database. That's where you want the client to say, I don't know how to handle this, and then basically do that on the server and have it handle it.
Yep. That's a great starting point. So I guess the way that server actions work is it's exactly that. You can write a form event handler. I don't want to repeat what you just said, but yeah, write a form event handler, click save, goes to the database. But you're writing from one app. So you need some way, like if I'm writing React and I pass a function to a component, how do I know that like, oh, I want you to actually have this function so you can call it, versus like, no, this is like a function that you can't run because it accesses a database. So when you get to the point where you want to run this, just tell me about it, me being the server, and I'll run it. So that's what server actions do. That's what that's how you mark them.
With the use server directive.
You mark them with a use server directive, which then is going to tell your bundler to basically, when it comes across this function, it needs to pass. And you know how like functions are objects in JavaScript? Mm-hmm. So you can say like function add, blah, blah, blah. But then you can say add dot foo equals 1, 2, 3. Because like the function's an object, you can modify properties on it. When you want to mark a function, when you want to tell React that this function is a server action, you give it you do kind of like what you do with the client components. You take the function like add and you do add dot $$ type of equals, it's like symbol for react.server.reference or react.reference.server. It's basically telling React that like this thing is going to have a reference on the server.
Did you have to write this or?
Yes, you have to write this.
Okay.
So you're part of like the RSC implementation is your bundler kind of looks over all your code, figures out the things marked with use server, and then modifies them so they get those properties, the server reference property. You give every function an ID. We kind of talked about that with client components last week, and we'll get back into that. But you give every action a unique ID. For me, the IDs are like the module it lives in and the name of the function. So that's kind of a pattern that I've seen most frameworks use. So you can just think of like, my page #add would basically like the module name of the function is add. And then there's some other properties you can give it. Like you can give it this bound property that I believe is the binding that like the context, the binding that the function has access to, but I haven't done that yet. So that's something that mine are always null for that right there.
Interesting. So if it closes over something when it's defined.
Yeah.
And that would be static. It wouldn't be able to be.
Well, I think that in turn is then given to the client app, and the client app can pass those back.
Got you.
But let's.
Right.
I just want to highlight that there are a whole bunch of properties that you can decorate the function with.
Right.
Now, when your server component is rendering this function, it comes across when your React server is rendering this function. It comes across this function, and it's not going to try to pass this function like down to the client. It's going to pass the reference.
It transforms it basically. You could imagine AST into like an object that describes in the same way that
the client component
gets serialized. It gets serialized into a pointer. It's a reference.
Yeah, it's a reference.
Yeah.
It's interesting that when you're transforming the client components that we talked about last week, your server code is like literally not importing a component. It's replacing that import with this dummy object with like the type of client component reference and then rendering that. But in the server action example, like you still have the functions, you just decorate the functions. So you're not like replacing the function with an object. You still have a function
during the build, like during the bundling step.
during the bundling and when you're like
When you render
when
it?
you're running. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
So
yes.
the client has the source code of the function?
No, it doesn't.
Oh,
So this is what's kind of hard for me to kind of wrap my head around, that you're in the client component example that we talked about last week. Like every time the server comes across a client component, it's like, I don't know how to render that. So instead of trying to render a component, I just have an object that's a reference and it has like 3 properties. And I'm just going to use that instead. So it's like the component just completely disappears from the world of the server.
And it's not even imported during that.
Yes, exactly.
Which
It's
is
not
good because the client component could have side effects that need a window to run. So it could break the build in a sense.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's not even imported. It's like replaced. When you come across a server action, like you still have the function. You're just decorating that function with properties. And then the function gets used by React, gets passed to a client component, it gets used on a form, and then React doesn't, like when React is, oh, you passed a function to a client component, I'm not going to serialize that function. I'm just going to like serialize a reference data.
Pull off
yes.
the data, the
Pull off-
reference data.
Exactly.
So when you're rendering, like when you're SSRing it.
So let's no SSR yet. Just you are generating the payload for
The RSC payload.
the RSC payload.
Got you. Okay. Got you. So and that's not when the client reference is created. That's at bundle time. The client component references in the tree are created at bundle time, but the server action references are created at render time.
Yeah. So yeah, these are great questions. When you are bundling and you come across a use server function, by the way, we should say that like the way you mark functions is they need to be decorated is you put the very first line of the function has a directive that's quote use server end quote, just like use strict was or use client. When you're bundling and you come across this, you basically modify the code to add the references, but you're just adding the references in code. So you're like, say I have function add, I see it's a server component. I just, after that line,
Add a new line, add dot
line.
reference
Exactly.
data.
Add dot type of server reference, and then all the data it needs. Now that like, I'm just putting in code there. That code is going to be run at runtime when React is generating the RSC payload. So at runtime when React is generating the RSC payload, it sees that and it knows that function can be given to client components and given to forms. Forms can take server actions in the sense that you can do form space action equals server action function. And when the form is submitted, React will run that server action function.
It kind of makes sense, I think, because couldn't you have a server action that referenced, let's say, a variable in module scope, and let's say you invoke that action multiple times and it increments that variable. You would want it to be different each time.
Yeah.
So you have to wait until you render it. You get the version of the action that exists at that point.
No, we'll get into that because it's way, way, way simpler.
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about.
But you can't. There are things about the server action that could change in between form submissions, even if it's the same action you're passing in.
Yep.
But there's nothing about the client component that can change for a given app bundle build for a build. So that to me I don't know,
I guess
just
you
thinking
could,
out loud.
you could, yeah, what you're saying, like yes, but you could. I could tell you render this in this spot. You render this client component, and then you're not going to ask me for that client component until you come across that spot. So I could technically serve up a different.
Yeah, but for a given
right,
build,
right,
it's the code.
right.
There's no memory involved with the component definition. It's a file that's loaded from the server, and then it's parsed and read on the client. And that would be the same. It's like a fingerprinted route split bundle that has some client definitions. That's not going to change until the next time you deploy.
Yeah, it should. Yeah.
Whereas the server function has memory.
Yes. Yep.
So maybe that's I'm just hearing this for the first time, but yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about like there's so many different ways you can invoke these server actions. Let's start with the form. So you have a form, it has an action attribute, and you pass in the server action. If you try to have a server component render this without a server action, so it was like form, action, some regular function that's not a server action. During the render process, React is going to blow up. It says, hey, you're trying to pass a client component. You're trying to pass client
function
features.
as a prop to a client component. It's not functions aren't serializable. You can only pass plain primitives.
Right. Doesn't make sense because if I wrote a function on the server and then tried to pass it to the client, like how can the client call it? That function was written to run on the server.
Right.
I think the way I like to think about this is like you have a function that does like console log hello world.
Right.
And you pass it from the server to the client and the client runs it. Like, where does that hello world show up? Because it was like defined on the server, but it's being invoked on the client. So it's just like this is an ambiguous mess kind of. So that function, like React blows up during render. You can't do this. But
same reason you can't pass render props from a server component to a client component.
Yep.
Because a render prop is a function that takes in children and returns in. It can have
But going back to how you started this with the form that adds a record to the database, like you want ways for the browser to be able to call functions that live on the server without having to set up new API endpoints and making fetch requests and error handling and all that. So you decorate the function as a server action by doing that type of reference thing. And then now when the RSC payload is being generated, instead of trying to serialize the function or blowing up because you're passing a function, it just has a reference in there. And so the client gets a form with a reference. And the kind of like the beauty of this is now when you submit the form on the client, React is just going to take over. It knows that there's a server action attached to this form. And so on the client side React app, you have a space where you can write a function called call server. And call server is going to get invoked with a few different arguments, one of them being the ID that you attach to the server action when your bundler is just reading all your actions. And then what call server does, like call server is just an empty box for you to put whatever you want in there. So like there's nothing about like
the implementation, like the APIs on the React side that tell you how to do that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's just call server. Hey, client
you could
app,
send a message to a WebSocket connection.
You could load an image. Like you can do like just all these ridiculous things. WebSocket is a great one, but that's like a more realistic.
Yeah. Turn on a Bitcoin miner. I was going to ask, like at this point, is this where in your implementation you write like a slash? Because I think you had a slash endpoint that we talked about last week, but do you have like a slash actions?
Yeah. So single
endpoint, and it takes in the type of and the params or whatever, and then it can look it up, and that's what you were saying. And they have a way to look up the action and then invoke it. Yeah,
exactly. So call server gets invoked in the client app, and what do I do there is I send a post request back to my Node server saying, hey, you need to go run this action, and I pass it the ID. So it's like path to my module #add. Like that's like the name of the ID.
Right.
And then I have two endpoints. One is like a get endpoint for rendering RSC payloads, and then now this is a post endpoint for invoking server actions.
Very cool.
Yeah, and you could there's no real it doesn't have to be two endpoints. It could be one. It could be you could have one for every action. Like
but it's
really
nice because they do different things.
Yeah. I think there'll be like an abstraction where you share a lot of code. Just a little side note. When you're looking at other people's RSC implementations, it is so funny how fast you just it's like the rocket ship ladder of abstraction where you're just like and you can see why, because there's so much that can be shared.
Yeah.
But it is funny so I'm like, oh yeah, there's an awesome abstraction here.
I want to get to that, but let's finish this part because I do want to talk about that. And I think there's a lot to say there. So you send the name, you can look it up, and you send arguments as well, right? Because the caller, when they invoke an action, they can pass form. So does form data, is that part of the spec, or do you have to grab it and pass it.
We'll get to that
Yeah,
because
okay.
there's three different ways you can invoke these. And
Cool.
yeah, there's a lot of decision tree stuff here.
And maybe we can do the other stuff next week. Cool. But let's see how this goes.
So you call server on the client, you run this, you send a post request to your node server. Your node server gets the name of the module or the name of the ID.
The reference of the server action.
Right, which in my case, path to a module and path of export. So then my node server does a dynamic import on that module.
Require?
No,
Or import.
Dynamic import.
Okay.
Yeah. Not, is it, it's called dynamic import.
Yeah,
where you do
await
like
import
yeah,
with
exactly.
the parentheses, yep.
Await import and then import that name, everything after the pound sign, and invoke the function. And so this is a way to get back to your question that you originally posed. I am importing that module at request time. So if it has any state, that state now like lives in my node app. So all the state it references, it's just
It's
available.
the value at that point in time.
Yeah.
And if you were to call it again, would it go through that again? Like the second time?
The second time, so the way like the
Maybe this is like the cache import. Like does import have a dynamic import have a
exactly.
cache?
So this is like how I guess the module spec is written, but the import would basically say I've already imported this and give you same reference back to that module.
Right.
So
and
any
look it up
state,
in the
So any state would still be there. So you could have multiple client apps all invoking the same server action that increased the counter by one, and they would all share that counter just based off how like JavaScript modules work and their caching system.
Right. So if you had an object in scope and it had like a count property, you could increment it. And every time, even if you've already imported it, if there's like an import cache, like we've run into that with Node before, require common JS stuff. But even if there's something where it's already been imported, it could reference that object, the same object. And so you would get a different result. If you're, let's say you pass no arguments from the front end, and the server action has an object called data bag or whatever, and it has a count property, and the action does data.count++ return data.count. So every time you submit the form, you're going to get a new count.
You will always modify that same
You will always
object.
modify it. And if it returned it, it would get a new version. It would get that latest value. It would get a different value.
Wait, sorry.
Data count plus plus, it goes to 1, and then you return data count as 1. Then you call it again, data count plus plus, now it's 2, and you return data count as 2.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So that's the thing where the definition hasn't, in the same way the client component definition hasn't changed for a given snapshot of the repo, a deployment. But the difference is it can reference, environment state there.
Yes.
And so it's stateful. Function invocation is stateful. Component definition is not really stateful, which again, I'm just trying to talk through why it makes sense that client components are turned into references at build time, and functions you have to wait until you request them to like load them and run them. Maybe I could be wrong.
I guess I have to think more about it.
The client component definition is part of the bundle, but the function environment is part of the runtime.
Yes, that is true. Yes.
Yeah. So if you had like a process environment in there, it could change over time.
Yep.
Without the code changing, or you have like a variable in module scope. Correct. Dude,
which is great because your thing could connect to a database.
Right. Exactly. The database connection is there the whole time.
Yeah.
And it's a function. It's not like a code file, so it's a little bit different. Cool. Okay. So now
one of the awesome things about implementing this is you kind of have to write your own system to undo all that, because every time I save a file, I want to like clear the module cache, so I get a new import, because I don't.
Right.
So you write like all this like caching code anyway. Just more stories of implementation.
Yep.
So you once you invoke call server on the client, it runs the server code. And
what do you do with the result?
You like from that point, you don't have to do anything. Like you invoked call server, you did something in call server, you did something on the server. Now probably you're doing some sort of mutation, like you're changing a database or increasing an account. So you want like the screen should probably update, right?
Right.
So in my case, I take the current URL that you're on, I re-render that on the server, send that back to the client, and the client knows to do like a VDOM diff with that new URL. So imagine you are on a screen with a count, and you just like the client component had a form. It was count +1, invoked a server action. The count would increase in module scope. New render would happen. It would get that new count, send down to the client, and client would like redraw with that new count.
That's awesome. I feel like we jumped ahead like 2 steps because that's like amazing, and that's what I wanted to get to. First, let's just really quickly cover the arguments side. So far you invoke it, and let's say you didn't wire up that behavior to re-render.
Yep.
So far, when we talked about the reading side last week, you had wired up things like navigations to change, and we had even talked about. That's right. The code path that goes through like the get side of RSC, and it causes the VDOM diff. How do you trigger that in your implementation? Navigations, but there was also a way to do it. Just you could write up something that did it every second.
Yeah.
There's like a function you call. It asks the server for the RSC payload, and then it takes that and it calls react.render, right? So
yeah, it's basically that is the RSC payload is a promise that when it resolves is renderable.
Okay, got you. Right. And then you call render somewhere. So if you didn't have that automatically happen, you could orchestrate on the client. Like the flight controller could be on the client. You call a mutation, and then you call something like whatever, re-render. That's like possible. I mean, you could just have access to a re-render function whenever you want.
I mean, in my call server, after I send the request to the server, I could do window.location.reload or whatever.
Well, yeah, but to get the diffing thing, you could also call re-render because it's the same mechanism that you're using to update the screen if the URL's changed, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So let's say we're there. The action is a fire and forget. And then you can re-render if you want to. Now you want to send arguments over. I guess arguments, when you invoke it, just because you have a reference, but you're still writing it as if you're invoking it. So you can pass arguments in. And again, just like you explained, you're sending a post request to /RSC with the type of and the name of the function. And then you're also, I'm guessing, you can send arguments to it. So that when you, in your handler on the server, you look up the action and then you want to invoke it with some arguments.
Yep. So like you're adding a new post to the database.
Right.
You need to be able to send over a post title.
So like the form data that ends up in Next.js that you get in the server action, how does, when you're implementing the action side, is that something that you have to wire up, or?
So let's talk about, we'll get.
How would you get form data?
Yeah, let's talk about just, let's talk about a really simple version first, and then form data is going to be the exact same thing. But I think the simple version will be, I have a client component with a button, and when I click it, I want to call server action, and I want to pass
1
in,
and 2.
Yeah, I want to pass in like the mouse location or something.
Yeah,
so it's a client component.
Right.
It needs to read the mouse location. It's going to pass in some X coordinate,
right?
104. So you have a client component. You pass the server action to it. When you like literally call that function, this client component, it's going to call that call server function that you define that lives at like the root of your React app. Call server can take arguments. So if I call that function with like 104, call server is going to get the name of the server reference as well as any arguments. And in this case, it is going to be, let's say I'm calling with a number 104, like not a string, just number 104. Now I need to send that data over to my server, and this is a really cool part where the React Server implementation really helps you out. They have a function that you import called encode reply. So I can take those arguments that you called me with, and I can pass them to encode reply. And what it gives you back is like a string JSON encoding. So if you did like string 104, it would be like the JSON.stringify string 104. Or a number, whatever. From my point of view as an implementer, I don't care. I just know that there's a way that I can encode arguments and then safely send them to my server. Like they could change that to be like, oh, we're going to use message pack or base 64.
Right, base 64.
To me, it just doesn't.
It's safe for transfer.
Yeah, safe for transfer. Then on the server,
they have a decode.
Exactly, decode reply. And decode reply is going to basically, like I said, it's a JSON string because I called it with a number. So I decode it, and then I get the arguments, and then now I can import my server function and call it, passing in the arguments that decode reply gave me. So the form data case is pretty much exactly the same. But when basically decode, I think encode and decode reply, they take like either strings. I think decode reply takes either a string, which is going to be that JSON encoded, or it takes form data. So if you have form data, like you don't go through that whole JSON process. So if you have form data,
It's already safe.
it's already safe. Exactly. So when you submit it, it gets submitted as form data, and then your server can read the form data depending on what your server is implemented in. That's
Right.
either really easy or really hard. Lucky for me, I started this project like 2 weeks ago, so I'm not dealing with Express or anything. It's really easy to read form data with like modern. I'm using Hat Tip, which is just an awesome Node HTTP server. They work everywhere, but it's awesome. You just do request.form data, and you can read in the form data.
Nice.
Yeah. So you
It
get
has
that.
the same APIs as it does in the browser, like remix
Exactly.
actions do.
Exactly.
And-
It's like a modern web server.
Nice.
Works everywhere. Normalizes those
Nice.
APIs. So yeah. So I can use. I will say this. Just one little thing to add in here. The form data that you submit in your form, when it goes to call server on the React on the React client side, React basically decorates it with a whole bunch of other information that like React uses, and then it sends it over to encode reply is going to decorate it, and then it sends it over. Actually, I'm not sure if encode reply decorates it. So let's just say that React is going to decorate your form data on the client with a whole bunch of information.
Okay.
It sends it over to the server, and then if you were to just read that form data, it's going to have weird names. That,
Okay.
like, so you pass it to decode reply,
and
and
it takes
decode
it off.
reply gets you like the form that you feel like you're working with, that you
Gotcha.
think
Yeah.
like that
Only
has like,
has your data from the fields.
so example, like if you have like a name field, it's going to get encoded as like 1_name. So decode reply just transfers that into name. There's also some other stuff, I think, like some like scope stuff that gets encoded there. Again, I'm not doing any of this in my app, so I just go to decode
Maybe it's just
reply.
smoothing over some HTML spec stuff. Like if you have two inputs with the name, they're both added, but we need to tease them apart. So we give them like our own IDs.
I think React wants to.
Because if you try to serialize and maybe you turn it into a JSON and you can't have the same keys, but like forms can have like multiple inputs with the same name, something like that maybe.
I again, it's all form data. So, but there's just more information
Yeah.
available
Yeah.
for the React runtime on the server. But when you're invoking your server action, you just want like the form.
You want to
that
feel like you're in the
felt you were
client. That you
writing
just,
on the-
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So that decode reply gets that all out for you.
Nice.
And then that you have a form, right? Because decode reply can take a string, get back the objects that you called it with, or it can take a form and you get back a form. So now that I have a form, I can import my server action and invoke it and pass it the form. And then in that case, your server action is just doing like, form.get, the form
Right,
data
right, right,
API.
right,
so
right,
form.get name,
Oh,
a bunch
front
of
end trees
type
or
of
whatever.
checks
Yeah.
because it might not be a string.
Or Zod or whatever. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So, and then that's how you can pass arguments, whether they're mouse position, something on the client, or even just you have two buttons. One you want to call the server action called add with 1 and 2. This one you want to call with 1 and 3.
Yep.
And if they happen to close over it doesn't really matter. And if they close over something on the client, it's going to turn into an argument. That doesn't matter, because if I had like first number and second number in React state up here, and then I call add and I reference it as a closure, it's just at the time that it gets invoked.
Yes.
That's just how JavaScript works in the client. But if you have an argument on the definition side that's in the server that is referenced via a closure, then something special happens, right?
So in my implementation, I only let you define server functions in top level module scope,
Okay.
or in a file that's marked with use server. So you can't like close over anything at request time. because those definitions happen before request time.
What about if you imported like a const or like a variable, or you just had some local, again, like that top thing we were talking about where you have like object data bag equals open parentheses, open bracket, count, colon, 0. And then when you define your action and then you like console.log
Yep.
object.data.
So
or
you
data.count.
You will get the data.count at the value of that will be the value of it at the time you're invoking the action.
Right.
So it doesn't say like,
And that gets passed along. That gets
no, it
that
doesn't
ends up
get
in the
passed.
client.
No, it doesn't
okay,
get passed
it doesn't.
along.
Okay, gotcha.
It basically in this case the client just has like, I want to run this function from this module, and then you load that function from
because
that
it's not being
module.
passed as an argument. Right.
Yeah,
It's
you
just
load
referenced.
that function from that
Gotcha.
module, and that module can have closures and everything inside of
That's
it.
normal JavaScript. In Next 13, it's different, right? Because
In Next 13, you can define functions in render.
Right.
So then they
That's
depend
why.
on the current render.
and that ends up as part of this the type of the data reference that's hanging off of the function in the client. So
the
that
client,
if you look at the client, what it's sending over to your post request to /RSC, it has the function identifier, any arguments you're having from the client, but potentially also arguments that were sent over during render when it was created.
Right. I have like, this is something that like I think is cool, but I'm probably not going to add it to my implementation
Until you would see a situation where you would absolutely need it. But
yeah, it would basically be two different reasons. Like the first is it's like
too much power.
it's really hard like to go from like, yeah, it's really, I think for this, I would want like more guidance from React Server components and like more tools similar to how
It's hard on the implementation side, or it's
hard on the implementation side. I would want more tools like encode reply and decode reply, right? That just kind of smooth over that for me. Like, given I have a function that can be created during render,
Right.
and then needs to be called later.
Right.
Like, I don't want to keep track of like decorating that function and all that. Like, I would want guidance from them. Like, this is how you do it. There's one way to do it. This is how we think you should do it. Right now, I feel like there's just not enough guidance. And then the other thing is, and this might be like more of an excuse because the first reason it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
But I made a mistake in one of my next apps where I did during render I fetched a user, and then I also need to know if the user was an admin to render something. So I had like is admin, current user is admin. And then in the server action, I only wanted you to update it if you're an admin. So I just did like if is admin, you can update this, otherwise you can't. Because
it was created at render.
Because
if you
it was
like
created at render.
is admin wouldn't change or something?
No, is admin is passed from the client to the server.
Ah.
So this is a mistake that I think is gonna like again like
It's a scary kind of stuff. The stuff that like Rich and Ryan Florence have talked about. The blurring the lines makes it easier to slip kind of both to leak sensitive information, but also to write them in a way that accept sensitive information.
Yeah, to accept information you like. Oh, I said it was
environment.
I said you were an admin, but like because you define that function in render, now it's state needs to be passed in from the client component.
How'd you fix that one?
Oh, so how do you fix that one is inside
the action.
Inside the action, you refetch the user.
Right.
And then you check if they're an admin.
And how do they get the session or the cookie? Or they just look at the cookie.
In
request.
Next, they have
cookies.
Yeah. They have an import you can use.
Cool.
I think
interesting.
I think it's like
so. I understand that is the reason why you think they have it is because the way we write a lot of our event handlers on the client, we use closures a lot because it actually removes a lot of boilerplate. If you're iterating over a list of to-dos, and you create a to-do component and you give it a to-do and you want to like handle delete, then you can use a closure to get the ID of within the loop without having to like write something new each time, right?
Yeah.
So we write that. A lot of if you look at like a Hello World app the way we would build it, it would have like add to do and delete to do. You know, our recipes have this right in render. And that they can close over an ID that's passed in, let's say.
Yep.
Is that kind of the idea you think they're going for, where like they want people to be able to write it in that style even though it's using it. So that would be an example of a variable. We probably would write it the same way. Actually, you'd probably take like some of the demos we have like on our recipes page, and when you click to move it to do, instead of updating state, you would literally just take that, and turn it into a server action, but the ID is being passed in. The ID is not sensitive. Making sure I have the authority to delete it is.
Right.
So the server action would still need to do authorization, but that kind of non-sensitive data, like the ID of the to-do that you want to delete, that could be passed from the client, and it could be done in a closure so that you can preserve this kind of way of like doing React app architecture that we like. Is that kind of, you think that they're like why they even support it to begin with?
Yeah, my take on this is like if you just like taking it like a really big step back and look at the big picture here, it's to be able to author a single application that spans both the server and the client.
Right.
So client components and server components just intermixed with each other.
Right.
And then the same is also true, like client components with event listeners that are firing server functions.
Right.
So you would want, in that case, you would want like
the
Azure
actions
servers
defined as during render.
Yeah. So that they are now callable from client components. I think the thing that gets lost though is there's no like it's just really easy to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And I've heard solutions like will encrypt everything and sign everything. So if someone tries to like tamper with
something that wasn't created
input
at render time, we would know.
Yeah. So it's like, oh, if someone actually tried to pass like, is admin true when it was really false?
There's
like,
a signature with this function that can be
it.
verified when we invoke it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or like, oh, I have like my function is connecting to a database and I need the database credentials.
Interesting.
That if I close over database credentials, those leak.
Yeah.
So, but I want to be able to close over them.
Yeah.
So maybe I encrypt them.
Yeah.
And so like they can leak, but they're not human readable.
Right.
And so I think like just
interesting.
Kind of where I stand is all the things that I've needed to do in this model. Like I'm usually working with forms or like buttons that can invoke server action. It's actually usually forms. I would say 90% of the time it's forms. And adding a hidden input is really easy, and then you don't have to close over anything. So in the ID case,
you're aware mentally that this is in the output.
So this is
going to end up on the client, so it can't be sensitive information.
And this is like
is admin true or something.
This is some friction for me in my head where like I'm kind of making this argument that like you don't want to close over things because it's too easy to make a mistake.
Yeah.
But then I'm also making this argument that like you want to abstract away the client and the server, and you want to just think of this as one app.
Yes.
But as soon as you make a hidden input, which is what I'm recommending you do, but as soon as you make a hidden input, you're acknowledging that this is two different apps because this is now data that's like going to get serialized.
Yes.
By the way, today I absolutely think this is the best.
It's pragmatic.
I think
it's what's really interesting about that whole story you just told is that's pragmatic because it's well understood, and you could even imagine other RSC implementations choosing to not let you define things in line, choosing to have to be in a separate file, so you can't close over anything that's created.
Or top level is fine.
Top level, and you can't close over during render. You can't close over things that are created during render, which is where the confusion can happen. There's still a huge benefit to that because you are getting rid of the explicit connection with the API route, right? You want to invoke this function when you click the button. Now you can do that, or when you move the mouse or whatever. So you're eliminating like the most tedious part of doing actions and mutations today, which is defining an API route, invoking it with fetch, blah, 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 blah. But that solves that part, which is great. But then there's this next level, which is like the aspirational level, which is like the single paradigm. The story reminded me exactly of the reading side, the rendering side, because you could say, start with create React app. You have to data fetch in effects. And it's like, well, that's a pain because you have all these extra states. You have to render before you can fetch. Next 12 introduces get server side props. Oh, that's awesome. I can like click, load, and all I want, like this effect stuff with these waterfalls and all these different states, I just want you to give me a function that can fetch data and then pass it to my component as props. That's all I need. That solves so many pain points. But then when you look a couple of years later, you flash forward to RSC and the course you just made, you realize if you can cross the bridge and get the paradigm, you get the extra benefits that we're convinced of now.
Yep.
So maybe we're in that middle stage where it would be a good first step as the whole community is figuring out how to use them. Try not to do fancy things with them, or because if you're running into problems with exposing secrets, or like you said, it's just confusing because there's a lot of new stuff. You could just use them as importable functions, and that would save you from having to wire up API endpoints. And you do basically it's a controller method that you would write in Rails in a server action.
Yeah.
But you're thinking about it like an endpoint. You're
thinking like
about
a
it like
function
an action.
endpoint.
But then if it happens that it works in this way that can be defined in render, I mean, it does technically work, but if it's not confusing and there's patterns that emerge, this is what I'm thinking. You take a demo of like my reminders list that I have for an animated list, and it's just operating on React state. You click add and it like calls set state. You click remove and it calls set state filter. All of those are in like one component. It's like one component that does that. Mm-hmm. If you can go from there to literally just changing those handles, add and remove, to server actions, and nothing else changes, that's pretty amazing. Because then I think that is the goal. It should feel like writing a React component that adds and removes items from a list on the client. But now, and it goes back to your tweet, which you said like 3 months ago, once you finished this demo, then you were tweeting about, you said, it really feels like React's going to abstract away the network. And that's kind of like, feels like what the goal is here, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'm totally on board for this. But
it's early.
It's
untreaded, untested waters.
I would say like,
what's the phrase?
Yeah.
What's the phrase? Thursday night. You know, Thursday night is Friday night eve.
Wow. I think what you said, I'm just going to ignore. Untested waters.
It's not the phrase.
Uncharted waters.
Uncharted waters. Boom. Boom.
Okay.
We're professionals.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think as an implementer,
right,
of a framework, the
Ryan framework.
My defenses
Toronto
go
JS.
Bugs JS. No, as someone with RSC implementation, like my defense, I want to go on the defensive and be like, that's so much more work for me to add that.
And if it's complex for you on the implementation side, it probably means it's more hard to understand for the authoring side too.
Well, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm giving my future self, I'm never going to use this in production. You're giving the users of your implementation rope.
Too much rope.
Way too much rope. All they have to do is close over is admin and they're done. So, but I agree with the vision. Like I absolutely agree with the vision, and I'm like totally on board. And yeah, it would be awesome if you just like, you're writing functions that just close over stuff. It's like, wait a minute, this is actually an API endpoint that's different for everyone, because everyone got different like render props based off like who their current user was.
Right. Exactly.
It is really, really cool. I would say that like I would want to see like a lot of guidance from React on how to do this. Mm-hmm. So I'd want to see like React say, okay, here's like the safe way, like when you're bundling and you need to change these functions, here's like the safe way to do it. Mm-hmm. Again, just back to that encode, decode, reply APIs that they have. Mm-hmm. I would really want to see them, not just them like, oh yeah, you should. And I think this is why server actions are in alpha right now, is because there's not a lot of guidance on this.
Right.
And so, yeah.
If you were just doing the to-do example or reminders or whatever, and you wanted to render the list from no animation or anything, so all server, and you just do map over the list of to-dos, you render a list item, and then each list item is a form that if you click it, it deletes it. And the form has an action and it's a server action. So you're not writing any client React yet. You haven't written any client components yet. You would have to use a closure for that.
No, you would do a form. You would do a form.
A form? With a hidden input, you're saying.
With a hidden input, yeah.
But if you wanted to do something where you do a form action equals, and then you do, it invokes.
You
do it. So if you did it with a closure, action equals anonymous function, right? And then whatever use server, it could import it or whatever. It could just import delete to do, but you would do anonymous function and then call delete to do with the ID in the loop. And that's where the closure is, correct? And that would be created at render time. And that would have to get serialized and this would all work. And the way to avoid that is to render the hidden input and call it. And now it's an explicit argument. Okay, got it.
Exactly.
Yep. And so, so that would be, So that, and okay, now I understood before, but that really makes sense where this would be like an interesting video to make. But you said, when you write the hidden input, you're doing it to get data from the render to the server to the action, the endpoint that you're posting to, and you're breaking out of the paradigm because you would never do that if you were just in client React. You just have the data in the loop already. If you needed like, you know what I'm saying? You would never read from the DOM to get the data if you were just rendering a loop of items in client React, and then you needed to do something like handle hover, show a modal of which to do you clicked, you would just use the thing in the loop, obviously, because you have it there. So that's kind of what you're saying. And that would be, okay.
But I like the argument.
The argument is
I'm going to take the argument. Like
if you outlaw that possibility, it both doesn't feel like writing React as much, but it also surfaces the concerns that are inherent in client to server communication.
Exactly. It makes it crystal clear that this is data that lives on the client. And it is being passed to the server.
Which avoids the potential errors with both exposing secrets or letting the client tamper with what's being passed back to the server.
Exactly.
So, interesting.
Exactly.
Interesting. But
exactly. I think so. I think
that's cool.
I think if those two go away, and there are like you can sit here and you can
armchair for the.
You can sit here and you can armchair like ways to get rid of
over everything on my first RSC app.
I know, and then have someone just come along and
delete
be like, "Oh,
is
that been true? Delete." I think you can armchair like really nice solutions that make those problems go away.
You gotta just test it out, though.
and then like this, it's solid. It's like
right.
But I think.
You want to see it play out. You want to see what emerges in terms of protecting certain things, or.
I also think too, from there's definitely tension here between paradigm and being pragmatic. So for me, the biggest pain point pre RSC, pre all this was, I want to write data to a database, and now all of a sudden I'm setting up API servers, and I know that it's like conceptually easy to do that, but it's pretty bad. Like it's pretty bad. Like I just want to talk to a database, and RSC so nicely solves that. So I don't really mind, like given that I get all that, I don't really mind the hidden input. I'm trying to be pragmatic, and you've got rid of the API endpoints.
Yeah, that's the huge benefit.
But I can understand the need, not the need, I can understand the desire to have like this single paradigm. Where you take the client component that closes over state, and now you move it to a server that closes over some database API, and look at that, like array in state to the database file on server, and everything else mentally still stays the same.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I think it will be, really, really cool if that lands.
Yeah. Nice. Cool. Why don't we wrap it there? But I think there's more to this conversation because talking about our discussion with like the respond value of the action, how that's different from rendering, and so that'll be interesting to talk about.
It's good. It's actually really good to, I think, address the fear of the server actions where you're leaking data. Or I think it's good to address that up front before you get into all the other stuff. All the other stuff is really cool, but also
you could have the biggest benefit of the server actions is you don't have to name an endpoint. You don't have to call it, know how to call it, decide on how you're going to pass the data, serialize, deserialize. It's all taken care of for you. There's one endpoint to do it. And you can do a fire and forget thing and still have an app that does mutations and re-renders, and that could be it.
And really, like if every React app looks the same in terms of how like the developer approaches mutations, you use a server action, that's so much better because like think about all our apps. We use a server on some, we use our own custom APIs. Like, you know what I mean? It's just
Yeah.
nice that everyone kind of
Yeah.
forms around server action.
I know, but the exciting thing about the server action being able to respond with the RSC payload you can use to update the screen is, to me, that's bananas.
Yeah.
Your server endpoint's never going to do that.
No. no, but I think like just the fact, like this seems very minor, but just the
Yes.
fact that like if we went off and we worked for 10 different companies,
Yes.
they would all have different
Their own protocols, their own API protocols,
Yeah.
basically.
everything from how they're like their JSON is shaped. I mean, maybe they're using GraphQL, so
Yeah.
maybe there's like some normalization there, but yeah, different backend services, different ways of invoking these things. And like now that it's just server action, I think that's a huge benefit.
It is, and it enjoys the same benefits that rendering with RSCs do, because RSCs are now like async components, but because they're integrated in first class, they can take advantage of things like suspense and transitions, and now your actions can too.
Yep.
So your actions can enjoy the being part of the first class ecosystem, both in React and then also the third party stuff. It's much easier for me to imagine how third party and community components could operate on any server action because they conform to a single interface than a third party component that has to interact with some mutation code that you have that's being kicked off by SWR, use queries version of use mutation, whatever all those different things are. Are they using suspense? Blah blah blah.
Yep.
So
Cool.
that's really exciting. Cool. Let's pick it up next week. And I think we just lost your video, so you're going to have to just wave from the abyss.
Yeah.
Goodbye to everybody. But folks should check out your course. I know we've been talking a lot about RSC, but it's been, I think it helped. I think we talked about this last week with just, I feel like the course is really good. So if you're interested in getting an introduction, you should check it out. And we're definitely be making more server components content and build UI. I don't know when, but we are going to.
Yeah.
For sure, because it's pretty awesome. We're excited about it. We like using it ourselves. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. But otherwise, I guess that's it.
Yeah.
And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
All right, bye.